man, I've been so looking forward to this conversation. I have Nicholas Centino here with me today. Nicholas, welcome.
Hey, how's it going?
We're surviving, right? Definitely not thriving, but surviving.
Doing what we can, doing what we can.
Yeah, you actually we're going to get to this point in our conversation, but man, you have been like on your feet with this pandemic, with your teaching and sort of your research and your writing. But gosh, like Santa Barbara PhD, you're there in Oxnard, CSU Channel Islands now. You've taught at Loyola, you've taught at Irvine. Man, you have like worldwide experience here, not to mention your own kind of background growing up in the Central Coast, all informing everything that you do that I love, that we're going to share a little bit of that journey with our viewers, our listeners. So Nicholas, how did you get into Latinx pop cultural studies? What's your origin story?
Yeah, I think for me, having to navigate culture and more specifically different cultural sensibilities has been like a thing in my life since I was born. So I grew up in a multiracial household, and so on my mom's side, her dad, he's Manito from the back hills of northern New Mexico, southern Colorado. Her mom is a Korean War bride, and so he served in the Korean War, and so brought her back. That story is fascinating because she was from an upper class family, almost upper caste family in Korea, in Seoul. During the war years, her folks were Japanese collaborators, and so after World War II, they lost it all, but they still have quite a bit of wealth. So you have someone from this very cosmopolitan background all of a sudden finding herself in the San Luis Valley of Colorado amidst potato fields and a whole lot of nothing. And so that's one story that I really would love to be able to dig into and share with folks. But that's on my mom's side. On my dad's side, my grandmother is, she's from Sonora. We assume we're of Yaqui descent. It's one of those things where there's cultural things in your family that you think every Mexican family, every Latinx family does, and you find out they don't. And so that we assume that we're Yaqui descent just based off of some traditions that we've had in our family on that side for quite a number of generations. But my father's dad is from the Philippines. And so we assume, and this is a big question mark, we assume that my dad is Filipino and Mexican. We don't know for sure. And the tricky thing there is that, abiding by the orders of, the old world, when my grandmother married my uncle's dad, he passed away under dubious means or under dubious circumstances. So it's in those type of situations, the widow then is married off to the next eligible bachelor in the family. So the next eligible bachelor was my step grandfather, who was from the Philippines, and so we still don't know if that was some kind of in-law situation or if they were in fact related by blood. So. And also having the Korean descent doesn't necessarily help when you're trying to discern Filipino descent. So, so going off of phenotype, well, he looks kind of Asian. Like, well, that could be the Korean side, it could be Filipino, but we don't know. So I had to navigate, really these four different cultures growing up and out of almost sheer survival, right? When an elder's yelling at you and one is saying, look at me when I talk to you, and the other one's saying, look at the ground when I talk to you, right? Those are things that you really have to suss out really, really early in life, right? If you're trying to get by just as a youngster, testing the waters to see how much you can get away with in your young life. And so that really sort of, first out of sheer survival, but then later out of like sheer curiosity, was how I wanted to really make sense of, first sort of my own crazy family and my own crazy situation, but also looking more broadly at the community that I was growing up in. I grew up in Lompoc, because it's very small, very almost isolated area of northern Santa Barbara County. You know, it's in Santa Barbara County, is sort of in SoCal, so to speak, but it feels very much like Delano or Stockton or any one of these other Central Valley type towns. One that had, you know, Filipino kids, one that had a huge Hmong population, that had, you know, African American kids I went to school with from the Air Force Base, obviously, you know, Anglo kids, Native kids. And so sort of growing up in this blue collar soup of different cultures and seeing how people, you know, respond to different stimuli, whether it's, you know, the music that they like, or, you know, where we were going to go for lunch or who brought what, you know, really was something that fascinated me. And I think as I really started looking at culture as a way to better understand, you know, in a more empathetic way where folks are coming from, right? That really sort of was something that kind of carried with me throughout my youth, and then was something that really started, you know, gave me, I would say, inspiration, right? When I started getting into Chicano and Chicana, Chicanx, Latino, Latinx pop culture through Chicano studies at UCSB. And, you know, taking classes with folks like, you know, Jonathan Inda, Yolanda Borges Gonzalez, a lot of the other great faculty there really inspired me to start, you know, perhaps thinking more critically about how culture also holds a mirror up to institutional forms of oppression in our society as well. So it wasn't just sort of, you know, I can get to know this person by understanding maybe their cultural background. Is more about in terms of thinking about how culture, right, reflects the lived conditions in which people are coming up in or struggling with. And so that really, you know, sort of was something that carried me through, you know, the undergrad years, and then was a bug in the back of my head as I sort of, you know, slog through life in the nonprofit sector. And when the opportunity came up to, you know, perhaps pursue a graduate degree, pop culture actually was one of the furthest things from my mind. I was interested in being a labor historian. But, you know, as I got back into, you know, sort of higher ed, got back into that grind, and then the notion of being able to use culture as a way to sort of backdoor your way into, right, into sort of more systemic things that folks deal with, that's when it sort of became something that took more of the limelight in terms of what my focuses were on. The history part became memory, right? The aspects around labor became looking at things much more broadly as people struggle in different arenas. But really, you know, pop culture became kind of the glue that held it all together as sort of an entry point that I could wrap my head around. Then made the broader narratives make sense. That then made the demographics make sense. That then made the statistics make sense, right? And those were always sort of things that I had trouble unpacking, right? And so pop culture in particular gave me a way to better unpack those things that to me felt more cold, more distant.
Wow, what a what a journey. We could probably say for sure, like Nipantlero warrior, right?
Yes.
Latinx pop cultural study guru here, in the blood. Just kind of brings me to now. I know we're a little bit ahead of the game on this one because it's not out for till I believe the summer, but you know, Razabilly, and I know you've done some kind of work in smaller units in this space, but yeah, why kind of finally decide to focus in on this as a space for this kind of research where you're pulling out history and memory and labor relations and laws and policy making, but in and through lived Latinx, Chicanx cultural production?
Yeah, so this project came out of, to be honest, this project came out of a really bad idea, and that was, you know, in sort of the thrust of grad school. I thought I could kill two birds with one stone and write a seminar paper on something that I was pretty intimately involved in, right? Something that was a leisure practice that I sort of went to as a way to escape the stresses of academic life. And so, you know, that turned out to be a really, really unwise choice, in part because, you know, for a lot of folks that are, whether you're students or whether you're, you know, professional academics, once you turn that, you know, analysis brain on, it's really hard to turn off. And so things that you really enjoy and really love, right, all of a sudden you find yourself second guessing and nitpicking at every turn, right? And so Razabilly as a research project was one that was really crafted out of my love for this community, right? This LA community of folks that adore rockabilly, right? Whether it's rockabilly, the musical genre, whether it's rockabilly as sort of that, you know, 1950s inspired, you know, pinup style or greaser style, whether it's rockabilly in terms of thinking about it as just, you know, memories of the atomic era, whether it's, you know, 50s, 60s, lowrider era, that it's all become sort of this retro soup, that Razabilly kind of encompasses all that, right? And that as a project, it really was something that at first, you know, was just sort of my musings on why I love this thing that I felt, you know, very passionately about. But then I really wanted to kind of, you know, provide a way for it to not be just about me, right? To really dig in and talk to and get to know some of these other enthusiasts. And when I started doing that, it really started taking a life of its own and started going in directions that I never would have imagined it would have went. This project, you know, in terms of setting the groundwork, it does look, you know, backwards, right? So we get into the roots of, you know, rockabilly music, but we rewrite Latinidad back into the history of rock and roll, right? And so I think a lot of times, you know, we have our Richie Valens and we love Richie. Sometimes, you know, folks will mention that, you know, you know, there's other folks here and there, but a lot of times, you know, it sort of begins and ends with Richie. And looking at sort of, you know, other folks that were recording at the time, looking at the folks who didn't have a chance to record, what were a part of this grassroots movement of, you know, I wouldn't necessarily call it movement, but this grassroots cultural moment of rock and roll sort of, you know, hitting the teenscape. And kids, you know, all you need is, you know, a beat up guitar, an amp, maybe someone might have a bass, and then if you're lucky, you get a drum kit in there, and you're good. And, you know, it's like, you know, the garage rock of the 70s. All you need is just, you know, a room to jam, and you've got it going on, right? And so the project does take that backwards glance, but also I really wanted to anchor it and focus it in sort of this moment of the late 90s and early 2000s, in part because that particular iteration of Latino Latinx engagement with rockabilly was, for one, the one that I sort of, you know, saw from a distance and then sort of like came into as it began shifting into something else. But two, for those who remember it, it was such a nadir moment in their lives, and how anyone in Los Angeles talks about their scene, you know, and thinking about it as a scene was one way in which I really wanted to sort of have this community of folks be remembered, right? It's not really a subculture. It's, you know, it is sort of, you know, it is its, you know, its own sort of, you know, alternative culture, if you want to use those type of, you know, terms. But for me, thinking about it as a scene, as making a scene wherever you go, right? As it being migratory and transitory all across LA, not just being in, you know, in one club on one night. That's this thing that sort of, you know, wherever they shall gather, it shall be, right? That was something that provided young folks at that moment in time a respite, right? A respite for what? A respite for whatever else was happening in the world at that time, right? So for me, it made me revisit those you know, Bush 2 years, right? Just before and after 9/11 and what was happening politically, and it made me, you know, revisit and think about the moment in which I was conducting the research in real time, which for me was a disaster, but in hindsight, in developing the book, was the book, which is the impact of the 2008 global financial crisis. And so for me, working on this project and compiling these narratives, a lot of times narratives that were focused around things that had just happened maybe 4 or 5 years prior, in the middle of financial crisis, where venues are drying up and people are throwing in the towel and giving in, while other folks are grinding by. How, why, and whether Latinas and Latinos and Latinx folks in the rockabilly scene chose to weather it out became the central, really the central thesis of this book, right? It became a book about resilience. It became a book about sort of the tenacity of this community to struggle, right? Just as they had, right, kept this flame burning for this style of music that was, at this point, 60, 70 years past its prime, so too were they going to keep that flame burning for themselves, right? For their own livelihoods, for their own happiness, right? For me, for me and for a lot of them, the pursuit of leisure for most people, right, is this sort of, tertiary, ephemeral thing. But for these folks, right, growing up and living in many cases, some of the most impoverished areas, Los Angeles, facing a lot of challenges that, dealing with, racism, misogyny, transphobia, the list goes on and on. That pursuit of leisure became a very political act. And for some of them, that political component of it was very apparent. For others, it wasn't so much so. And so being able to, refine some of these narratives, present them in a way that folks could gain something from, that neither sort of demonize folks nor romanticize them, I felt was really the most fulfilling part of working on this project.
Well, I can't wait for it. I have to say, Texas killed it on the cover too. I'm sure you love it.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow. Love it. Yeah, kind of as you were talking, it got me thinking, and we don't have to talk about this now, but at some point, maybe you and I need to kind of go back and think what it is we do as Latinx, Latino, Latina, Chicanx pop culture scholars that builds on, but that's also kind of radically different from like Birmingham School,
right?
Cultural Studies. Gosh, I think that needs to happen, next for us. But let me ask, so obviously, like Razabilly, all the things that are you just talked about, but the sound and also the sort of sartorial, the fashion, the look, as a kind of not just a style, but something like you were saying, the sort of these points of negotiation, ethno, race, gender, class, sexuality. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So, in developing kind of, language by which to describe sort of what I encountered in the scene, I started turning to like different theorists, different scholars. And the most, the one that came closest to kind of describing what this, this onda was about was this idea of stance, of there being a Razabilly stance, right? And I kind of pulled this from, to be honest, social linguistics, and this notion that if you have a stance on something, right? So there's first sort of like if two politicians are going to debate, right? Both are going to take stances on a particular issue, right? And then they're going to try to communicate to the audience what that stance is, and so. And if you want to get into the theory of it, right, stance is sort of my communication to you, my thoughts about, whatever, right? So it's A communicating to B about C. But also there's, just the image of someone taking a stand, right? Someone assuming a stance, and that so much within the scene is intentionally performative. Right, that there is sort of a stance to it. So there, the on the slide here we have, Vicky and her vengeance, and sort of she has, very much, a lot spoken through just that glare, right, at the camera. And there's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek type of thing going on here, right? There's a little bit of a sort of, a high camp, so to speak, but also there's a genuine authenticity of who she is, kind of behind the hair, behind the makeup, and all that. There's both of that, And so for me, the Razabilly Stance was one that had cooked into it, right? This legacy, this history of pain, but also of resilience, right? And so the way in which sort of the music comes together with the sartorial style, with kind of the attitude, the sort of, whether it's the cold, almost stoic, somewhat indifferent stance that a lot of the women assume, whether it's sort of that cocky, sort of, boyish, sort of, charming but not so charming stance that a lot of the men take on. That within that there is sort of a reference to memories of the 50s, right? And so, within Razabilly, you see sort of folks drawing on memories and influences, kind of reverberating out 10, 12 years away from, I would say, 1956 or 1957. And so you see, folks adopt some of the more sort of pachuco 1940s-esque mannerisms or sartorial style or musical styles. You see folks, going more in sort of the lowrider direction with, the in terms of style, right? The Pendletons or the beaded sweaters, with the car customizing, the more sort of rat rods versus, the bombs, so to speak, right? And within that, right, within how folks choose to not only adorn their bodies, how folks choose to sound, whether they're musicians, there's also sort of the way in which they carry themselves, right? The way in which they move through the world. That that the outfit is or the fashion, it's not just for this weekend warrior type of thing. That these are their clothes, right? And the affectation of the full body tattoos, for men and women to have full sleeves and chests and backs and legs tattooed. This stuff they got to carry with them the day in, day out, right? So that sort of, I wouldn't necessarily call it a scene allegiance, but their sort of, commitment to that look, right, 24/7 is one not necessarily without cost. I think, in our contemporary world, it's very different now to have a tattoo. It's a lot more accepted, in 2020 than say in 85 or 92, so to speak, right? But still sort of, our bodies still matter, so to speak, right? And so for a brown body to adorn itself with the trappings of the 1950s or the 1960s or the 1940s, right, to curate themselves in a way, right, that is meant to cue history. I found that for a lot of folks, it was this very intimate process, even though it was such a public act. And how their bodies were read, how their music was read, how their cars were read, was one that played on existing narratives, existing sort of cultural narratives of the past. And for me, again, not necessarily a trained historian, but so for me, the veracity of those historical claims, that didn't matter to me, right? Whether they got the history right or wrong, whether they had, vinyl upholstery in their 1939 Pontiac, right? That didn't matter to me as much as what they felt they had needed to queue up for folks, right? That Latinas and Latinos and Latinx community members in LA, right, had a much longer history and much longer claim to that city than what contemporary news or contemporary culture at that time was telling them, right? And so again, right, we're looking at sort of coming off the heels of 9/11, where anyone who doesn't necessarily fit the bill as your typical, you know, Anglo-American suburbanite is suspect. And so making sense of how folks who had, for one, been sort of denied that history in their K through 12 education, right? You know, typically we get very little on the mid-century in our history classes, and when we do, you know, we get Cold War, we get maybe Elvis, and then that's about it, right? But to have, right, an anchor for themselves, not only in a history, but also a history of the city, right? So you have not just time, but also geography, was something that I felt, as I talked to folks, resonated through a lot of these narratives, was meeting a need, right, at a given point in time. And so there's a lot of, you know, different rabbit holes that I really wanted to delve into and uncover, and just didn't make it into the text. And so you know, I've been, as this project has been developing, I've really been thankful for opportunities to be able to, you know, have different spin-off articles and such to be able to explore those. So but absolutely,
Yeah.
you know, thinking about all of this as a collective expression was, you know, one of the huge challenges of this book, but also one of the things that was really fun kind of digging into.
So powerful. I love your concept of to curate, and especially putting that together with collective, you know, Latinx. So curating of a kind of collective Latinx space, but also really powerfully speaks to a lot of the other scholarship and cultural production, which is to say, sometimes we, you know, the mainstream thinks that somehow, like, you know, we have this like tradition stuff that comes from, you know, centuries past, and yes, there is that, but more often than not, it's stuff that we're making now that our children will have as a
Right.
tradition, right?
Right.
So powerful what you're doing. You also tell me, so you're involved in so much, but also like literally, like physically involved. Tell me about like this, you know, Barrio Boogie, and also your own kind of, you know, work within that space. Yeah.
Yes. So this was these were, I don't know who blessed these projects, but these were so much fun to work on, and I'll explain my thing about the blessing in a quick second. Barrio Boogie was a sort of a concert slash car show slash festival that I had the pleasure to work with a really amazing team of cultural producers in Mariachi Plaza, there in the heart of Boyle Heights in Los Angeles. This ran, I want to say, for about a year and a half. Started small, started as, you know, just a small gathering of, actually, to be honest, it started as a commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the Zoot Suit riots. It was a small group of folks that I had reached out to on social media, had sent invitations out to, you know, let's meet up at, you know, where the original Club Pachuco was, right? You know, Christine Sterling's attempt to do youth programming there in Alvera Street. And we met up when we had, you know, lunch in Alvera Street, and that was it. But within that gathering was, you know, the notion that, hey, you know, this could be a thing. This could be something bigger. And so the Barrio Boogie team, myself, John Carlos, Jake, Jeanette, Richard, and later on we've had, you know, other amazing team members come in and come out. Really wanted to have something that was accessible to the community, that was, you know, no cost, but also was a family affair. So we really wanted, you know, for young folks who, you know, weren't 18 yet to be able to enjoy the type of music, the type of scene that we all as sort of the Barrio Boogie team had grown to love and really cherish. in a way that was, right there in their community. It started off with, maybe a band, a DJ, and then by our last festival had just ballooned into a block party. We had, gotten the permits, had cut the block off from just, I want to say, just before the freeway to almost to the police station that's there. And so, and fingers crossed, candles lit. We never got shut down. We never had any sort of violence or any sort of altercations. Never had any complaints. And so it unfortunately folded. The team, our team, really, as our lives kind of went in different directions, sort of, for one, had already counted our blessings in terms of having gone through the previous festivals, but two, we also wanted to kind of end on a high note. And I think we had literally thousands coming out from out of state, all across the city, to our last festival. And we didn't want to lose that moment. So there's always been sort of people asking for another one, and there's always been sort of ideas on the back burner in terms of what a 2022 Barrio Boogie might look like. But as of yet, it's been sort of something that we've really sort of kind of not necessarily close the book on, but sort of maybe close the chapter on, and we're just waiting for the right opportunity to perhaps.
Or maybe it's that time for those times in our lives when it's time for us to pass the baton on to the next generation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm excited to see where that goes in the future. You are, we're going to get to your teaching practice, in the classroom in a minute, but there's like, you and we don't even have to like explain this to each other, but I think for our audiences, maybe we can talk a little bit about this. Teaching by other means. I mean, teaching is not just something in the classroom space. And so tell me, like, how you see your teaching in the kind of bigger space, the bigger public.
Yeah, so I really strive to be as much a public scholar as I can. And so, I adore my students. I try and make the classrooms that I offer at CI as constructive a learning environment as I can. But I think I would also be remiss to not, say that I also really love engaging a broader audience, right? Not necessarily just those bound within the walls of academia, but just, if I can just grab someone's attention for 2-3 seconds and maybe provide them with a different way to think about something that maybe they thought they had the book written on, then I'm happy, And so the Razabilly project really came out at a time in terms of sort of as I started maybe presenting on it more, as I was able to contribute a couple articles. Definitely want to give shout out to your work with the Rutledge collection. Really had a great time producing the piece for that work. And the sort of incongruous nature of a bunch of Latinx kids in LA, born decades after the height of sort of 1950s rock and roll, then fall in love with rock and roll, was enticing enough for folks really to pay attention in that moment. So I had a handful of folks reach out just for comments, but also it was a great way for me to just meet folks that were curious about this topic, and get a sense from them, what they were reading out of it too. And I think being able to engage folks who are curious, and through those folks being able to engage folks in a much broader sort of way, for one, is like really, obviously, like it's rewarding, right? Because like, oh yeah, there I am. I'm like, my name's out there, But two, also, like, I think understanding sort of the circumstances that folks are going through, right? It takes it back to that sort of not primordial, but that concern that 4-year-old me had, right? Like like what is up with these people? Like, how can I, I want to know what's up with these folks, right? Like, you know, being able to get the word out about something, right? And in a way that is critical, in a way that is ethical, right? In a way that is empathetic, for me, is really crucial in this moment when there's so much, right? Aside from just flat out lies that get perpetuated out there, right? Just the ways in which our sort of monoculture has taken a turn towards the cynical, right? Towards sort of the negative in some aspects, right? Being able to get the word out there that in a way that sort of is both kind of critical, but also is not scared of being celebratory, I think is something that I also really, really cherish. And so whether it's being able to comment on, rockabilly, whether it's able to jump in and comment on, lowriders in Japan, whether it's, these other aspects that folks find interesting, being able to, provide something in a way that's constructive and nourishes growth on the part of other folks, I think has been really, really rewarding.
Yeah, it's we have to shine the light on all of the incredible kind of cultural production out there that's actively changing what kind of culture looks like and has been for a while. So yeah, I really appreciate all the work you do. And of course this plays, very centrally into your core, and your core is sort of someone who works within the space of social justice. Can you, I don't know, I put some slides up here, that might speak to or kind of generate some ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that is, I wouldn't say it's difficult to navigate, but as you're mentioning earlier, sort of how we do things different than sort of the classic triple C, like Birmingham school. We don't take for granted that, right? Our forms of pop culture are inherently socially just, right? I think we're not a monolithic group, right? We've got a lot of diversity. We've got a lot of diversity of stances, so to speak, right? And so for us as as critics, right? For us as scholars, being able to unpack the potential for social justice within Latinx pop culture, I think is an important task. And also ways in which Latinx folks are able to reinterpret it and reappropriate just plain old stuff that they encounter, right? That isn't necessarily from a Latinx or Chicanx cultural producer, right? And so I've in quarantine been trying to wrap my head around the 40th anniversary of Empire Strikes Back, the second Star Wars film, and just how impactful the Star Wars franchise had been on activists who were kids in the 80s that were then teens in the 90s, right? And the image of Morrissey there, he has the rebel tattoo on his left shoulder, and how many times I've seen that tattoo on all kids of all colors up in Seattle, the Battle of Seattle, right? A lot of the anti-globalization, global pillage protests that I saw at that era, and still see some of those folks to this day working on the same types of issues. And so the reappropriation, reinterpretation of sort of whether it's Anglo-American or cultural productions, not necessarily from our cultural producers, is one that continues to fascinate me, and the sort of reinscribing of things that feel familiar to hit those cultural touchstones and hit those beats that resonate on a social justice level, something that I am always fascinated on, and not just necessarily as a scholar, but also someone who's interested in these different movements. For Latinx cultural producers, the ingenuity, right? The ingenuity and not only the ingenuity, but also sometimes the audacity to produce and say things that need to be said in a given moment, I think is something that isn't necessarily appreciated enough. And I think sort of that underdog perspective, right? That perspective, de abajo, that provides sort of, a crystal clear view of, of the stakes and the factors, whether folks are, commenting on issues of race, whether they're commenting on issues of, misogyny, homophobia, etc. Right? That perspective, I would say, right, is a huge factor in what make these pop culture productions so effective and so resonant, right? And so, for example, I'm thinking about, Ernesto Urena, and some of his poster work, Melanie Cervantes, the really, really resonant stuff and stuff that's, absolutely of the moment. So I would say, again, that potential is there. And so being able to, right, again, assess and suss out, right, how pop culture and how cultural productions serve in the aid of these social justice causes or movements is one that is important, but also really, really fun to do. And so, thinking about my students and thinking about, teaching social movement, whether it's history or whether it's contemporary social movement, sometimes it can get really dry. So infusing in, right, these examples of cultural production to teach about these movements is something that I really relish. And so in a way, these cultural producers are kind of, doing my job for me and by providing things with which I can help better allow my students to understand sort of, what these movements are about, who's involved, and why. And so, yeah, absolutely.
Love it. And nice segue to the kind of next point of discussion. You're an award-winning teacher, and I know you're a beloved professor. One of the things that caught my eye on social media earlier this year was your the Penny Dreadful, and you would kind of pull together folks into that space. But tell me, your watch-alongs, tell me, like, the study and teaching, right, of, for you, of Latinx pop culture. And, maybe, is there like a trademark Nicholas kind of method or way of bringing this into the classroom?
Yeah, so I love, I love working with students and developing their tools for analysis. And I really enjoy having students bring sort of their perspectives and their baggage into the classroom, so to speak. And so a lot of times in my courses, we'll look at and do a deep dive into a cultural production, whether it's a song, whether it's a television show, whether it's, a movie, whether it's a form of art, and really do a close read of that together as a class. And then sort of allow students to use their own tools of analysis to unpack that. And so sometimes, in the class we get into debates. Sometimes we get into, vastly different reads on examples. And so I wanted to sort of recreate kind of that same vibe, but for sort of a watch along, as a way to kind of role model for students a way to go about that, at the same time that they're sort of getting a critical read or critical analysis of a pop culture artifact. And so for Penny Dreadful, for the watch-alongs, I really wanted to pull together both folks who I felt were interested in talking about the show, folks who actually had showtime, and then also make sure that we had a diversity of backgrounds. And so for that program, really what we wanted to do was to have sort of the watch along for folks to enjoy in real time, but also was a package that sort of was something that could be a downloadable audio accompaniment or audio companion to the series if a student wanted to take this on as a project for their class. And so in terms of bringing this particular project into the classroom, I recorded these over the summer, and I'm going to use them for a introductory Latinx culture class that I offer in the spring. So there's going to be a few options for them for their writing project. One of the options is going to be to actually, sort of watch the show, watch the season with the watch-alongs, and then provide their own critical read as if they were a guest alongside the critics. So, trying to think about ways to like engage students in a way that doesn't necessarily talk down to them, but also provides them with something new that they can take away from the classroom, for me has always been sort of a challenge that I need to recalibrate every year. As you know, pop culture moves so quickly that, tried and true examples that work for, the 2 or 3 years in a row need to be jettisoned that 4th year, right? There was oh man, this was the best example I had of tropes. And that was the Cholo episode of Walking Dead, where, the protagonists, they get cornered by these, Latino gang members, and it looks like they're going to get the axe. But in fact, all these guys are taking care of elders in a convalescent home that they had saved from the zombies, right? That gag only works if you already know that these guys are trouble, right? And you need, to have this Cholo gangster bandido trope in your head and cooked into, your psyche for however many years for that to work. That show is now going to be over. After however many seasons of Walking Dead, and that being season 3, that pulp cultural text is no longer really relevant anymore. So I need to dig up and cook up a new example for that same trope. So always having to recalibrate, always having to really service the tactile nature of the classroom in that way, I find so exciting and so rewarding. It's one of those things that, when people talk about teaching as a craft, that, it's not just, we're not just broadcasters in a way. We're not just, on autopilot, right? We're actually in there working with a group of folks in a way to meet their learning outcomes, but to do it in a way that they actually enjoy it, right? That takes some labor. And so, and that's labor that I think we could be proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how you basically explain kind of my process as well, but I've never been able to kind of put words or kind of shape to it. So for you, Nicolas, speaking of how kind of living Latinx pop culture, well, it is living and it's moving. Where for you is the vitality today?
Yeah, so for me, it's really in that malleability, that Latinx cultural producers are ones that are adaptive, right? That they are inventive, they are ingenious, and that creativity, right? That brilliance, so to speak, when provided, an outlet, absolutely shines. And I think, it's becoming sort of, it was a long, I mean, within any community of color, I think there is this really bizarre moment where people are surprised when mainstream productions that involve Latinx creators do well, right? There's this moment of surprise, like, well, how did this happen? Why was this popular, right? And then it's the same story for Black creatives, the same story for API creatives, so on and so forth, right? The moral of the story should be, no one should be surprised. No one should be surprised when whether it's Black or API or Latinx cultural productions do well and resonate. in part because, right, the brilliance of these artists, right? I mean, I'm not, I can't end this this podcast without throwing a little shade, right? But the showrunners for, you know, for Game of Thrones, if you listen to interviews about sort of their process in creating that series, right? And this doesn't take anything away from the cast, production crew, or anything else, but in terms of, right, the work of the showrunners, you know, the many chances they got to make things right, to try things over, to do again. You can say the same thing for, you know, I would say what was it? The last X-Men movie, the Dark Phoenix, right? That's a remake of X-Men 3. That, you know, the writer of X-Men 3 got a chance to remake this movie a near decade later, right? That sort of, you know, this notion that mediocre talent, right, get these turn at the bat again and again and again, when truly innovative, talented, brilliant artists, right, aren't even shown a door in, right, it is a shame. And so for me, you know, where the vitality is once we're provided that opportunity to shine, right, once we get the keys to the car, you see things do well, you see things resonate, you see things sort of become these moments, right? Whether, you know, obviously, you know, most recently things like Coco, but it's more than just Coco, right? And also allowing us to be able to redefine success on our own terms, right? And so success isn't always what things draw on the auction block. It isn't necessarily what things draw on the in the box office, right? That success for a lot of us is speaking to a moment and having things be able to endure through that moment, you know? So yeah, that's my take on that question.
Well, thank you, Nicholas. This has been absolutely mind-blowing. And thank you for gifting us your time, your wisdom, your expertise, your Nipantlero, like, being. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. This was an absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed this afternoon with you.